Our journey into one of the most famous stories in the English language begins not with a celebration, but with a death. It is essential that we understand this fact clearly, or nothing that follows will seem wondrous. The story opens with a simple cold fact. Jacob Marley was dead. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. This sets the stage for a tale written by Charles Dickens in the year 1843. Just as we discussed the laws of the universe in the previous book, here we must understand the laws of the human heart in the frozen society of Victorian London. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I do not know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. But what a man this Scrooge was! He was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. He was a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped at his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm him, no wintry weather chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle, no children asked him what it was o'clock, no man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Now we must look at the specific moment when our story truly begins. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices, like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by, and was brewing on a large scale. Inside the office, the door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. This clerk, whose name we will soon learn is Bob Cratchit, represents the suffering working class of London in the 19th century, trapped in the machinery of industrial indifference. Suddenly a cheerful voice cried out, "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." The nephew returned the logic cheerfully. "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said, "Bah!" again, and followed it up with humbug. Scrooge continues his tirade against the holiday. He asks what Christmas is to him, but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older, but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you. He tells his nephew that if he could work his will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. The violence of this image shows us just how far removed Scrooge is from humanity. But the nephew Fred does not waver. He defends Christmas not as a time for commerce, but as a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded Fred's speech about the charitable nature of Christmas. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. Scrooge turned to the clerk and threatened him that if he heard another sound from him, he would keep his Christmas by losing his situation. Then, turning back to his nephew, Scrooge dismissed the invitation to dine with him the next day. He said he would see him in that extremity first. He said he would see him in the hell first, though he used the milder expression of seeing him damned. The nephew, despite this rejection, remained warm and cheerful, wishing his uncle a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year before leaving the room without an angry word. As Fred left, he let in 2 other people. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" Scrooge answered that Mr. Marley had been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago, this very night. The gentlemen presented their credentials and explained their mission. At this festive season of the year, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of time and necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts. Scrooge asked a question that chills us to the bone even today. "Are there no prisons?" The gentleman laid down his pen, surprised. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are, still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour then," said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." The gentleman tried to explain that these institutions scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, and that a few of them were endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. They asked Scrooge what he would put them down for. "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." The gentleman replied that he might know it. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business, and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slowly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were patterning in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. A young boy, gnawed by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, but at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop £0.50 for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used, when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill, at the end of a lane of boys 20 times, in honour of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at blindman's buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the City of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not in impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid colour made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in and lighted his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Poo-poo, and closed it with a bang. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. We must imagine the darkness of this house. It was not merely the absence of light, it was a presence, thick and heavy. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for it. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Old fireguard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it, and brood over it, before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like featherbeds, Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butterboats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts, and yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with a strange inexplicable dread, that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder, on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His colour changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long, and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and mark the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much," Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of grave than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit, staring at those fixed-glazed eyes, in silence for a moment, would play the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated, as by the hot vapour from an oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge. "I do," replied the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, notwithstanding. "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise, that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "You're fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost of Jacob Marley. "I made it link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this, 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men, nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house. Mark me. In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed, in a business-like manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow?" the ghost repeated. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge. "And travelling all the time?" "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace. Incessant torture of remorse." "You travel fast?" said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, cative bound and double-ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labour by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I." "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge. "But don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob. Pray. How it is that I appear before you in a shape that you can see I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered, and wiped the perspiration from his brow. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." "You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank ye." "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded, in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take 'em all at once, and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us." When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this, by the smart sound its teeth made, when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together, none were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost, in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable, and being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of the bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavouring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes, when the chimes of a neighbouring church struck the 4 quarters. So he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12! It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong, an icicle must have got into the works. 12! He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. "Why, it isn't possible," said Scrooge. "Hat that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon." The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of this first of exchange pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again, and thought and thought and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavoured not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3 quarters more, when he remembered, on a sudden, that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled one. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong. "A quarter past," said Scrooge, counting. "Ding dong." "Half past," said Scrooge. "Ding dong." "A quarter to it," said Scrooge. "Ding dong." "The hour itself," said Scrooge, triumphantly. And nothing else." He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy one. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child, as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view, and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon vigour. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was, that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using in its duller moments a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality, for as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away, and in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him it were at a distance. "Who, and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. "What?" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed his obligation, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise, and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that his bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. "I am a mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart. "You shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. "Good heaven!" said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odours floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it!" cried Scrooge with fervour. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognising every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance with its bridge, its church and winding river, where shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits, and shouted to each other, until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travellers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eyes glisten, and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas, as they parted at crossroads to and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good had it ever done to him? "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child neglected by his friends is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof, and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used, their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and how their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more attentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold and vast. There was an earthy savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself with too much getting up by candlelight and not enough to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a dormant echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed water-spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence, and gave a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly a man, in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt and leading an ass laden with wood by the bridle. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come for the first time, just like that." "Poor boy! And Valentine," said Scrooge. "And his wild brother Orson. There they go. And what's his name, who was put down in his drawers, asleep at the gate of Damascus? Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom, who was turned upside down by the genii. There he is upon his head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?" To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects, in a most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city indeed. "There's the parrot!" cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growing out of the top of his head. There he is. Poor Robin Crusoe, he called him, when he came home again after sailing round the island. Poor Robin Crusoe! Where have you been, Robin Crusoe?" The parrot had learned that, and Robin Crusoe thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday running for his life to the little creek. "Hello!" "Hoop-ho! Hello!" Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him, after drying his eyes with his cuff. "But it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing, mate," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost and with a mournful shaking of his head glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in and putting her arms about his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home!" "Home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful of glee. "Home, for good and all. Home, for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if he might come home, and he said, 'Yes, you should,' and sent me in a coach to bring you. 'And you're to be a man,' said the child, opening her eyes, 'and are never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world.' 'You're quite a woman, little Fan,' exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being so little, laughed again, and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, 'Bring down Master Scrooge's box there!' And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlour that ever was seen, where the maps upon the wall, and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows, were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine, and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered instalments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he had rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied onto the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster goodbye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. "Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost, "but she had a large heart." "So she had," cried Scrooge. "You're right, I will not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid." "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children." "One child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew." Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, "Yes." Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, the lamps were lighted. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it," said Scrooge. "Was I apprenticed here?" They went in. At sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig, bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes. There he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up," cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands. "Before a man can say, 'Jack Robinson,' you wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it." They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in their places. 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em. 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. "Hilli-ho!" cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. "Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hilli-ho, Dick! Cheer up, Ebenezer! Clear away!" There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid, with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook, with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands half round, and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping, old top couple always turning up in the wrong place. New top couple starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" and the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest, upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, though there were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home, exhausted, on a shutter, and he were a brand new man resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies, and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the entire evening was, when the fiddler, an artful dog mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But the great effect of the entire evening was, when the fiddler struck up the tune for the dance. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. They were the top couple, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them, leading 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners who had no notion of walking when they could dance. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and when the clock struck 11 this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shook hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wishing him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds. During the whole of this time Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now that he became conscious of the ghost's presence, who was looking at him fixedly. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter, self. "It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count 'em up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the Spirit's glance, and stopped. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all." "My time grows short," observed the Spirit. "Quick!" This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passions that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters little," she said softly. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" he rejoined. "A golden one," she replied. "This is the even-handed dealing of the world," he said. "There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth." "You fear the world too much," she answered gently. "All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach." I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion gain engrosses you. Have I not?" "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you." She shook her head. "Am I?" "Our contract is an old one," she said. "It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until, in good season, we could improve our worldly fortune by our joint industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man." "I was a boy," he said impatiently. "Your own feeling tells you that you are not what you are now," she returned. "I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you. Have I ever sought release? In words, no, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end. In everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us," said the girl, looking mildly but with unsteadiness upon him, "tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now?" "Ah, no!" He seemed to yield to the justice of this supposition, in spite of himself. "But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl, you who in your very confidence with her weigh everything by gain?" "I release you," she said, "with a full heart, for the love of him you once were." He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed. "You may, the memory of what is past half makes me hope you will, have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen." She left him, and they parted. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?" "One shadow more," exclaimed the ghost. "No more," cried Scrooge, "no more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more." But the relentless ghost pinioned him into both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place, a room, not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count. But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she with guileless face was borne towards it the centre of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onslaught that was made on the defenceless porter. The joy was immense, and now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon. Who was it?" "Guess." "How can I?" "Tut, don't I know?" she added in the same breath, laughing as he laughed. Mr. Scrooge. Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone, quite alone in the world, I do believe. "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are, do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face, in which in some strange way there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. "Leave me, take me back, haunt me no longer." In the struggle Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form, but though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting pull in which his hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel into the bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and lying down again, established a sharp lookout all round the bed. He wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck whistle 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and centre of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour. This light, being merely light and nothing more, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant or would be at. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, so he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own sitting room, there was no doubt about that. But it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked like a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone before. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man!" Scrooge entered timidly, and hung his head before this spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanour, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. The ghost then stood, "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe!" Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and that he just stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below, and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground. which last deposit had been ploughed up into deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times where these great streets branched off, and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away to their dear heart's content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavoured to diffuse in vain. The people who were shovelling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great, round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors, and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples, clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made, in the shopkeeper's benevolence, to dangle from conspicuous hooks, that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. But soon the steeples called good people all, to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes, and with their gayest faces, and at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes and nameless turnings, innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for we stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humour was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was, God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners and the progress of their cooking in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar flavour in what you sprinkle from your torch? Asked Scrooge. There is. My own. Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day? Asked Scrooge. To any kindly given. To a poor one most. Why to a poor one most? Asked Scrooge. Because it needs it most. They went on, invisible, as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully, and like a supernatural creature, as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks, for there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his four-roomed house. Then uprose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honour of the day, into his mouth. Rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire, until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled, "What has ever got your precious father then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha wasn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah, there's such a goose, Martha." Mrs. Cratchit kissed her daughter 20 times and took off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "Lord bless you alive, my dear, how late you are, ye," said Mrs. Cratchit. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night, missy," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind so long as you are here," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm Lord bless you." "No, no, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limb supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day!" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. Then Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hallo, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now her mind was off the cushion, she would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears! God bless us!" Which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake and the day," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Also how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collars so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in the Cratchit household. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof, and their clothes were scanty. But if they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. As they faded, the ghost of Christmas present and Scrooge stood in a dark and foggy wasteland, a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about as though it were the burial place of giants. Here the water froze in the deep furrows of the earth. This was the home of miners who laboured in the bowels of the earth, but even here they saw a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, were all decked out gaily in their holiday attire, singing a Christmas song together. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, flew out to sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them. The thundering of water, as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth, was terrifying. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed, the whole year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and stormbirds rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But even here, 2 men who watched the light had made a fire, that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other a Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them sang a wild song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on, until, being far away from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. Every man on board, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognise it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing, smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ha! Ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha! Ha! Ha!" If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily, "Ha! Ha! 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 Ha!" "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live!" cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. She was what the French call adorable. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, that he's ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and, with the dessert upon the table, were clustered round the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about, when they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing. You might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that Ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindnesses of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was first a game at Blindman's Buff. Of course there was, and I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My belief is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas Present knew it. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right too, for the sharpest needle Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eye was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour that he stood gazing at him with a smile, until Scrooge begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this the spirit said could not be done. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. Every new question put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found it out! I know what it is, Fred, I know what it is." "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge." Which it certainly was. The revelation that the savage animal was indeed Uncle Scrooge was met with universal admiration and a fresh explosion of laughter. Even the ghost of Christmas Present joined in the mirth, seeing that Scrooge himself, though invisible and unheard, was so caught up in the spirit of the game that he was enjoying himself immensely. Scrooge's nephew Fred proposed a toast to the old man's health, declaring that even if Scrooge wouldn't accept their affection, they would give it to him regardless. He raised his glass and said, "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. He wouldn't take it from me, but he may have it, nevertheless." Uncle Scrooge! The whole party echoed the sentiment, and Scrooge, in his ghostly state, felt his heart lighten in a way it had not for many years. The spirit did not leave Scrooge in that happy parlour for long. The ghost's time was fleeting, and they had much more to see before the midnight bell. From that bright room they sped away through the night, visiting many homes and many lands. They stood by sick beds, they were happy. They visited foreign lands, and they were at home. They saw people in struggle, and they were patient in their hope. The spirit stood beside poor men in their cabins, and they felt comforted. He visited almshouses, hospitals and jails, in all those places where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out. He left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had some doubts of this because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly and visibly older. Scrooge observed this change, but said nothing until they left a children's Twelfth Night party when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was grey. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight!" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near." At that moment the chimes of a nearby church rang out the 11:03. As the clock struck the final quarters before midnight, Scrooge noticed something strange beneath the spirit's robes. "Forgive me if I am wrong," Scrooge said, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. From the foldings of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but his words choked themselves, rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit! Are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." "Deny it," cried the spirit, stretching out its hand towards the city. "Slander those who tell it to ye. Admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke of the bell ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. This new spirit was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us," Scrooge pursued. "Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. Although Scrooge was well used to ghostly company by this time, he feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror, to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were, in the heart of it, on change amongst the merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him? Asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman, with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose, that shook like the gills of a turkey cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, cascading his fatness again. "Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody able to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer?" "I don't mind going if a lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose, "but I must be fed if I make one." Another laugh. "Well, I am the most disinterested among you, after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch. But I'll offer to go if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point always of standing well in their esteem. In a business point of view, that is. Strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, hey?" "So I am told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it? Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" No. Something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to contradictions apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob Marley, for that was past, and this ghost's province was the future, nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself, to whom he could apply them. But nothing doubting that to whomsoever they applied they had some latent moral, for his own improvement, he resolved to treasure up every word he heard and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared, for he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easy. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark beside him stood the phantom with its outstretched hand. When he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand and its situation in reference to himself that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene, and went into an obscure part of the town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognised its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and that whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. Far in this den of infamous resort there was a low-browed, beetling shop below a penthouse roof where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and sepulchres of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in by a charcoal stove made of old bricks was a grey-haired rascal nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop, but she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the arrival of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. "Let the charwoman alone to be the first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. And look here, old Joe, here's a chance. If we haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlour. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two aren't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, how it squeaks!" The door groaned on its hinges as old Joe led the three thieves into his cramped parlour, a room filled with the stench of decay and unwashed rags. The woman who had entered first, a charwoman with a hardened face, threw her heavy bundle onto the floor with a defiant laugh. She challenged the others, asking why they should be ashamed of taking a few trifles from a man who had no use for them anymore. "If he wanted to keep them after he was dead, the wicked old screw," she exclaimed. "Why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there, alone by himself." This sentiment of cold pragmatism was the direct result of the life the deceased had led, a life of isolation and avarice. Joe, the fence, crouched by his stove and began to open the bundles. The first woman had brought a collection of buttons, a few pencils, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value. They were appraised and their small worth recorded in Joe's ledger. The second woman, the laundress, produced her own plunder: sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her haul was slightly more valuable, but still represented the meagre leavings of a life that held no human warmth. Then it was the charwoman's turn again. She produced a bundle that caused even old Joe to pause in surprise. She had taken the very bed curtains from the bed where the man lay dead. "You don't mean to say you took him down, rings and all, with him lying there?" asked Joe, his voice a mixture of awe and greed. "Yes, I do," replied the woman. "Why not?" She had even taken the blankets and the shirt from the body itself. "He can't sink any lower than he is now," she remarked with a shrug. "It's the best he had. They'd have wasted it, if it hadn't been for me." As Scrooge watched this scene, he felt a cold shudder pass through him. He saw in these scavengers a reflection of his own philosophy, that everything has a price and nothing is sacred. Scrooge listened in horror as they joked about the man's lonely death. They laughed at how he had frightened everyone away while he was alive, only to be robbed by the very people who should have cared for him in his final moments. "Ha! Ha!" laughed the charwoman. "This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead. Ha! Ha! Ha!" Scrooge turned away. His heart sickened. "Spirit!" he said. I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this?" He realized that the greed he had cultivated in life had left him with a legacy of nothing but mockery and theft. The scene changed instantly. The spirit led Scrooge into a dark, cold room. It was a bedroom, and in the centre of it, under a ragged sheet, lay something covered up. The room was deathly silent, save for a low, rhythmic sound, the scratching of rats behind the wall. The light from the spirit's hand fell upon the bed, revealing the outline of a body. Scrooge knew that he was expected to pull back the sheet and look upon the face of the dead man, but he could not. The dread he felt was too great. The spirit's hand pointed toward the head of the bed, but Scrooge's own hand remained frozen at his side. He thought of the conversations he had overheard on 'Change, the casual remarks about a cheap funeral and the lack of mourners. He thought of the thieves in Joe's shop divvying up the spoils of this very room. He knew that the man lying there was the same man they had mocked, but the realization that it was himself was a truth he was not yet ready to face. "Spirit!" he cried. "This is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson, trust me. Let us go." But still the spirit's finger pointed at the bed. "If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death," Scrooge pleaded. "Show that person to me, spirit, I beseech you." The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. She was waiting in anxiety for someone, and when her husband had arrived, his face was careworn and depressed, though there was a strange light in it. He told her that the man was dead. At first she was shocked, but then a feeling of relief washed over her. "We are quite ruined?" she asked. "No," he replied. "There is hope. He is dead, and his successor will surely be more merciful. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline." It was the only emotion the spirit could show him caused by the death, a feeling of joy that a cruel creditor was gone. "Let me see some tenderness connected with a death," Scrooge cried, "or that dark chamber spirit which we left just now will be forever present to me." The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet. Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing. But surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out. As he and the spirit crossed the threshold, why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The colour hurts my eyes," she said. "The colour? Ah, poor Tiny Tim." They were drawing near the end of their task, but the chair in the corner was empty, and the little crutch remained leaning against the wall. The tenderness of this grief was a sharp contrast to the cold indifference he had seen before. Bob came in, his tea ready for him, and he spoke of the kindness of Scrooge's nephew Fred, who had offered his condolences. "It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us," Bob said. The family promised never to forget Tiny Tim or the first parting that was among them. The ghost of Christmas yet to come glided through the streets, its dark form a stark contrast against the grey, wintry landscape of a future London. Scrooge, now desperate for clarity, followed close behind. They left the modest, grieving home of the Cratchit family and returned once more to the bustling city centre. Scrooge looked around for his own image, hoping to see a man who had changed his ways, but again he was nowhere to be found among the living. The spirit did not stop at the counting-house or on change. Instead, it led Scrooge toward an iron-rimmed gate. This was the entrance to a churchyard. It was a place where the city's dead were cast, overgrown with weeds and choked by the soot of 1,000 chimneys. It was a miserable place, walled in by houses with no signs of life or care, a fitting resting place for a man who had cared for nothing but himself. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one in particular. Scrooge advanced toward it, trembling. Before he followed that finger's direction, he paused to ask one final question. "Beckett!" he cried. "Answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only?" Still, the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Scrooge crept toward it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The old scratch the merchants mocked, the man whose bed curtains were stolen by the charwoman, the body lying cold and alone in the dark chamber. It was all him. "No, spirit. Oh, no, no." Scrooge fell to his knees, clutching at the spirit's robe. "Hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been, but for this intercourse. Why show me this, if I am past all hope?" For the first time, the spirit's hand appeared to shake. Scrooge continued his prayer, his voice thick with tears. "I will honour Christmas in my heart, and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone." In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own, the room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own, to make amends in. Scrooge scrambled out of bed, his heart pounding with a joy he had never known. "I will live in the past, the present, and the future," Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. "The spirits of all three shall strive within me. O Jacob Marley! Heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob, on my knees." He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. "They are not torn down," cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms. "They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will." His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance. "I don't know what to do," cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath, and making a perfect Laocoon of himself with his stockings. "I am as light as a feather. I am as happy as an angel. I am as merry as a schoolboy. I am as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello here. Whoop, hello." He ran to the window, opened it, and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold, cold, piping for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious! "What's today?" cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look about him. "Eh," returned the boy, with all his might of wonder. "What's today, my fine fellow?" said Scrooge. "Today," replied the boy. "Why, Christmas Day?" "It's Christmas Day," said Scrooge to himself. "I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow." "Hello," returned the boy. "Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner?" Scrooge inquired. "I should hope I did," replied the lad. "An intelligent boy," said Scrooge. "A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one?" "What, the one as big as me?" returned the boy. "What a delightful boy," said Scrooge. "It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck." "It's hanging there now," replied the boy. "Is it?" said Scrooge. "Go on, buy it." "Walker!" exclaimed the boy. "No, no," said Scrooge. "I'm in earnest. Go and buy it and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown." The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger who could have got a shot off half so fast. Scrooge chuckled as he sat down to write the address. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's," whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. "He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's Wilby." The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there, waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye. "I shall love it as long as I live, people," cried Scrooge, patting it with his hand. "I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face. It's a wonderful knocker." The turkey arrived, and it was indeed a monster. The man who brought it could never have carried it upon his legs to Camden Town, so Scrooge hailed a cab and sent it on its way with a merry heart. Scrooge dressed himself in all his best clothes, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, our son, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far when he spied the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before and said, "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe." It sent a pang through his heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met, but he knew what path lay before him, and he stepped up to him. "My dear sir," said Scrooge, quickening his pace, and taking the old gentleman by both his hands. "How do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. Merry Christmas to you, sir." Mr. Scrooge, the gentleman exclaimed in disbelief. Yes, said Scrooge. That is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness— Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. Lord bless me, cried the gentleman as if his breath were taken away. My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious? If you please, said Scrooge. Not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favour? My dear sir, said the other, shaking hands with him. I don't know what to say to such munificent— Don't say anything, please, retorted Scrooge. Come and see me. Will you come and see me? I will, cried the old gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it. Scrooge went to church and walked about the streets and watched the people hurrying to and fro and patted children on the head and questioned beggars and looked down into the kitchens of houses and up to the windows and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it. Is your master at home, my dear? Said Scrooge to the girl. Nice girl. Very. Yes, sir. Where is he, my love? Said Scrooge. He's in the dining room, sir, along with mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please. Thank ye. He knows me, said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining room lock. I'll go in here, my dear. He turned it gently and sidled his face in round the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in great force, for these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points, and like to see that everything is right. Fred, said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her being sitting in the corner with the footstool, or he wouldn't have done it on any account. Why, bless my soul, cried Fred. Who's that? It's your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred? Let him in. It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon. He did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open, that he might see him come into the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen and as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. Hello, growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. What do you mean by coming here at this time of day? I am very sorry, sir, said Bob. I am behind my time. You are? Repeated Scrooge. Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please. It's only once a year, sir, pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir. Now, I'll tell you what, my friend, said Scrooge. I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, he continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again. And therefore I am about to raise your salary. Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. A Merry Christmas, Bob, said Scrooge with the richness in his voice that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon, over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town or borough, in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe. For good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes and grins, as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed the knowledge, may that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. With these words, the story of Ebenezer Scrooge's transformation concludes, proving that no soul is too cold to be thawed by the heat of human compassion. We have travelled from the dark, frozen counting house to the warm, glowing hearth of a man reborn. As we look back on our own lives, let us remember the lessons of the three spirits, to cherish the memories of our past, to be present in the joys and sorrows of our neighbours, and to build a future defined by love rather than greed. The transformation of Ebenezer Scrooge is not merely a fairy tale of holiday cheer, it is a profound philosophical investigation into the nature of the human soul and its capacity for rebirth. When we look at the structure of this narrative, we see a mirror of the scientific and philosophical inquiries into time and existence that have fascinated humanity for centuries. Just as a scientist seeks a unified theory to explain the laws of the physical universe, Charles Dickens seeks a unified moral theory to explain the laws of human interaction. Scrooge begins the story as a solitary oyster, a man who has intentionally decoupled himself from the gravitational pull of human sympathy. He exists in a state of stasis, much like the static universe theories that preceded our modern understanding of expansion. By the end of his journey, Scrooge has moved from a cold, fixed point of isolation to a dynamic state of expansion. This transition is facilitated by the three spirits, who function as observers in the space-time of Scrooge's own life. The Ghost of Christmas Past serves as the record of his initial state, showing how a series of events, loneliness at school, the loss of a beloved sister, and the choice of gold over love determined his trajectory. This is the deterministic view of the soul, that our past dictates our future. However, the intervention of the spirits introduces a quantum element of uncertainty. They show him that while the past is fixed, the future is a field of probabilities that can be altered by a change in the observer's heart. Dickens uses the character of Jacob Marley to illustrate the entropy of a wasted life. Marley's chain, made of cash boxes and ledgers, is a physical manifestation of the disorder he created by ignoring his business of mankind. In our scientific understanding, the arrow of time moves toward increasing disorder, or entropy. For a man like Scrooge, this meant that his isolation would only grow more profound and his heart more disordered as time progressed. The spirits, however, provide a reversal of this arrow. They allow Scrooge to witness his own end and, through the terror of that singular point of death, find the energy to reorganize his life into a state of high moral order. Beyond the personal redemption of one man, A Christmas Carol serves as a powerful critique of the social laws of the 19th century. During this era, many believed in a kind of social Darwinism, where the poor were seen as a surplus population that should be left to the harsh natural laws of the workhouse and the prison. Scrooge is the mouthpiece for this cold and rational approach to humanity. When he asks the portly gentleman if the prisons and workhouses are still in operation, he is appealing to a system of logic that ignores the individual quanta of human suffering. The Ghost of Christmas Present challenges this by showing Scrooge the fine-tuning of the Cratchit family. Despite their poverty, they exist in a state of perfect harmony, proving that the value of a life cannot be measured by its mass of wealth. Tiny Tim, in particular, serves as the weak force that exerts a massive influence on Scrooge's heart. The threat of Tim's death is what finally breaks Scrooge's jaded view of the world. It forces him to realize that the surplus population consists of real individuals with names, hopes, and entangled connections to the rest of society. The legacy of this story is that it redefined the initial conditions of how we celebrate the holiday. Dickens did not just write a book, he launched an inflationary period of generosity that continues to expand every December. He taught us that business is not just the exchange of currency, but the exchange of light and warmth. Just as scientists seek a theory of everything to explain the origin of the cosmos, we can look at the carol as a theory of everyone, a reminder that we are all fellow passengers to the grave and that our time here is a precious, finite resource that must be spent with intention and love. To truly grasp the gravity of Scrooge's transformation, we must analyse the initial conditions of the world he inhabited. The London of 1843 was a city of extreme density and pressure, much like the early states of the universe described by scientists. It was a time when the Industrial Revolution had created a vast disparity between those who held the mass of wealth and those who existed in the vacuum of poverty. Charles Dickens was not merely writing a ghost story, he was acting as an observer of a social system that seemed to follow cold Newtonian laws of cause and effect. In this system, if a man did not possess capital, the force of the law, the poor law, and the union workhouses would inevitably pull him into a state of misery. Scrooge's philosophy was a reflection of this deterministic worldview. He believed that the lives of the poor were fixed by their lack of industry, and any intervention was a violation of the natural order. When the portly gentleman asked for a donation, Scrooge's refusal was based on a belief that his business was a self-contained system that did not need to interact with the external environment of human suffering. This is the ultimate poverty of spirit, a state where the heart becomes an event horizon, allowing no light or sympathy to escape. Scrooge lived in a static universe of his own making, where every day was an identical repetition of the last, frozen in a frosty rime of indifference. However, as we have seen in the study of physics, a static system is often an illusion. Just as the universe must either expand or contract, the human soul cannot remain truly neutral. By closing himself off, Scrooge was not maintaining a balance. He was contracting toward a singularity of total isolation. The arrival of Marley's ghost was the perturbation that broke this unstable equilibrium. Marley showed Scrooge that the invisible consequences of our actions, the chains we forge in life, are as real as any physical object. This section of the narrative forces us to ask, what are the fundamental forces that truly govern our lives? Is it the strong force of greed, or the universal gravitation of human connection? The resolution of Scrooge's journey represents a quantum leap in his character. In the classical physics of his old life, a man could not change his trajectory once it was set, but the three spirits introduced him to the uncertainty principle of morality. By showing him shadows of what might be, they demonstrated that the future is not a single unchangeable path, but a sum of histories. Scrooge's final plea at the gravestone, "I will live in the past, the present, and the future," is a rejection of linear time in favour of a unified theory of existence. He realises that every moment is a big bang, a new beginning where the laws of his nature can be rewritten. When Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning, he's in a state of inflationary joy. His energy is no longer zero-sum. He discovers that by giving wealth away, his own internal energy increases. He sends the monster turkey to the Cratchits, an act that offsets the negative gravity of his previous neglect. He enters the orbit of his nephew's family, finding a stable state of happiness that he had long ago abandoned. The paradox of Scrooge is resolved. The man who wanted to decrease the surplus population ends up becoming the second father to the very child he thought was worthless. Ultimately, A Christmas Carol tells us that the ultimate goal of humanity is not the accumulation of matter, but the unification of our hearts with the rest of the world. Just as scientists hope to one day find a single theory that describes the entire universe, Dickens suggests that love is the single force that explains why we are here and what we owe to one another. As the bells of London rang out on that transformed morning, they heralded more than just a holiday. They celebrated the ultimate victory of the human spirit over the darkness of its own creation. And so, the story ends, not with an extinction, but with a rebirth that continues to echo through the space-time of our shared culture. As we delve deeper into the late 19th century, we see that the London of 1843 was not merely a backdrop for a story, but a complex mechanism of industrial progress and human suffering. Charles Dickens was writing at a time when the steam engine of society was moving faster than the moral compass of its leaders. If we analyse the structure of Scrooge's world, we find it was built on the Newtonian belief that every action in the market had an equal and opposite reaction in the lives of the poor. But this was a cold, mechanical view of existence. Scrooge himself functioned like a high-pressure cylinder, containing all his energy and resources within his own narrow walls, never allowing the heat of his wealth to power anything beyond his own counting house. This isolation was a direct result of a society that viewed human beings as units of labour, rather than beings of light. The Industrial Revolution had brought about a massive shift in the population density of cities, leading to the very surplus that Scrooge so callously discussed. The smog that filled the air in the opening scenes was a physical manifestation of this industrial growth, a dingy mist that obscured the faces of the poor and turned the city into a phantom world. Dickens uses this atmosphere to show us that when we prioritise mechanics over mercy, we lose our to see the true nature of our fellow man. Scrooge's counting house was a closed system, where the only law was the accumulation of profit. He did not realise that by refusing to participate in the exchange of human kindness, he was creating a vacuum in his own soul that would eventually collapse under its own weight. This section of the narrative invites us to look at the social architecture of the time. The union workhouses and the poor law were designed as regulatory systems to handle the excess of the industrial machine. But as the Spirit of Christmas Present showed Scrooge, these systems failed to account for the quantum value of a single human life, like that of Tiny Tim. Tim was not a statistic, he was a vibration of hope in a cold world. By ignoring the weak forces of charity and empathy, the architects of Victorian society were building an unstable structure. Dickens suggests that the only way to stabilise the human experience is to introduce a universal constant of love, a force that transcends the mechanical laws of the marketplace and recognises the infinite worth of every individual. In our final analysis of the Carol, we must consider the spectrum of time that the spirits revealed to Scrooge. Each spirit represented a different wavelength of his existence. The ghost of Christmas past was the infrared, the heat of memories that still burned beneath the surface of his cold exterior. The ghost of Christmas present was the visible light, showing him the vibrant, immediate reality of the world he had tried to ignore. And the ghost of Christmas yet to come was the ultraviolet, a dangerous and invisible future that threatened to burn away his legacy if he did not change his frequency. Together, these three spirits provided a complete observation of Scrooge's life, allowing him to see the unified field of his past, present and future. This synthesis of time allowed Scrooge to overcome the paradox of his own nature. He had spent his life trying to conserve his wealth, but he learned that true conservation applies only to the spirit. Matter and money can be lost or stolen, but the energy of a good deed is never destroyed. It simply changes form, passing from one person to another. When Scrooge gave the prize turkey to the Cratchits, he was not just spending money, he was radiating a new kind of energy into the world. This act of emission changed the orbital path of his entire life, moving him away from the dark matter of greed and into the bright star of community. He realized that the ultimate theory of the universe is not found in a set of mathematical equations, but in the simple harmony of a shared meal and a kind word. As we close this chapter on Ebenezer Scrooge, we are left with a profound conclusion. The origin of our personal universe may be fixed in the past, but its expansion is entirely up to us. We have the power to fine-tune our own lives to be in resonance with the needs of others. Just as the stars in the sky are held together by gravity, we are held together by grace. The story of the Carol is a reminder that even in the absolute zero of a frozen heart, there is a quantum potential for warmth. If a man like Scrooge can find his way back from the edge of the abyss, then there is hope for the unification of all mankind. And so we look forward to the next epoch of our journey, carrying the light of the torch with us into the unknown future. As we transition into the next phase of our exploration, we must examine the physical and social geometry of London in the year 1843. The city was a sprawling network of contradictions, a place where the gravitational pull of the marketplace dictated the movement of every soul. Charles Dickens lived in a world where the population was expanding at an inflationary rate, yet the resources for the poor remained finite and scarce. If we look at the map of Scrooge's London, we see a series of concentric circles. At the centre sat the city, the financial heart, where men like Scrooge and Marley calculated the density of their profits. Moving outward, we find the cluttered orbits of the working class in places like Camden Town, where Bob Cratchit lived in a four-roomed house that seemed to defy the laws of physics by containing so much love and so little heat. The atmosphere of the city was a thick yellow fog, a composite matter of coal smoke and river mist that functioned as a mask for the social inequality lurking beneath. This fog was so dense had obscured the visible light of human connection, allowing a man to walk past his neighbour without recognising their shared humanity. Scrooge's counting house was a black hole in this urban fabric, a place where wealth entered but never escaped to radiate back into the community. He operated on the Newtonian principle of absolute independence, believing that his position in the world was entirely disconnected from the velocity of others' misfortune. He did not yet understand that the social fabric is a unified field where a perturbation in one area, such as the hunger of a child, eventually ripples through the entire space-time of the nation. In the conclusion of any great life or story, there is often a singular point that defines everything that came before. For Jacob Marley, this singularity was a death that left him fettered in a chain of his own construction. For Ebenezer Scrooge, the singularity was the site of his own neglected grave in that choked-up churchyard. Science tells us that at a singularity, the known laws of physics break down. In Dickens' moral universe, the laws of greed broke down at the foot of that headstone. Scrooge faced a big crunch of his own soul, a moment where the contraction of his life reached its ultimate limit. It was here, in the absolute zero of his despair, that he discovered the quantum potential for a new beginning. The rebirth of Scrooge on Christmas morning was an expansion of the spirit that mirrored the Big Bang of the cosmos. He moved from a state of infinite density, where he was self-contained and solitary as an oyster, to a state of infinite openness. He realized that the total energy of a human life is not found in what it accumulates, but in what it emits. By raising Bob Cratchit's salary and becoming a second father to Tiny Tim, Scrooge effectively reversed the arrow of time. He took the disorder of his past and reorganized it into a harmonious system of charity and joy. This is the ultimate victory of the narrative, the proof that we are not slaves to our initial conditions, but free agents who can fine-tune our own existence to be a source of light rather than darkness. The world of Ebenezer Scrooge was a closed system, much like the early models of a universe that does not interact with the infinite space beyond its own boundaries. In the year 1843, London was a place of rigid social gravity, where the wealthy remained in their high, cold orbits and the poor were pulled down into the dense atmosphere of the workhouses and prisons. Scrooge viewed his life through a Newtonian lens of absolute determinism. He believed that because he had worked hard and accumulated mass in the form of gold, he was entitled to ignore the weak forces of human empathy. He lived in a static state, refusing to allow any heat or energy to escape from his counting house to warm the absolute zero of the streets outside. To Scrooge, a man like Bob Cratchit was merely a variable in a financial equation, a unit that cost 15 bob a week and contributed to the entropy of his profits. He did not see the quantum complexity of a family like the Cratchits, who lived in a state of superposition, existing simultaneously in extreme poverty and extreme joy. Scrooge's field of vision was limited to the visible light of his ledgers. He was blind to the dark matter of the human soul that connects us all in a unified field of experience. He sat in his melancholy tavern, a solitary particle in a vast uncaring vacuum, believing that his position and velocity were the only things that mattered in the great mathematica of life. The arrival of the spirits represented a perturbation in Scrooge's stable yet dying ecosystem. Jacob Marley served as a messenger particle, carrying the force of a warning from a dimension that Scrooge had long denied. The ghost of Christmas past acted as a time telescope, allowing Scrooge to observe his initial conditions and see how the symmetry of his younger, more generous self had been broken by the attraction of wealth. He saw the light cones of his childhood, where the future still held infinite possibilities before they were collapsed by his own choices. This journey was not merely a stroll through memory lane, it was a relativistic experience where time and space became dynamic. Scrooge was forced to see that his identity was not a fixed point, but a wave function that could still be refined. The ghost of Christmas present showed him the spectrum of life as it existed in the now, from the infrared warmth of a miner's cottage to the ultraviolet energy of his nephew's party. He began to realize that the universe of human interaction is not static but expanding. The spirit used its torch to sprinkle a catalyst of peace upon the chaotic streets, showing Scrooge that a unified theory of kindness could balance the equations of social discord. As the chimes of the city rang out, Scrooge found himself standing before the most daunting observer of his life, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. In our study of the physical world, we often speak of symmetry, the idea that the laws of nature remain the same even if we change the direction of time or space. But here, in the cold streets of a future London, Scrooge saw the asymmetry of his own existence. He was shown a world where his mass, his wealth, had become a vacuum. The merchants on 'Change spoke of his passing with the same indifference one might reserve for a minor atmospheric change. There was no gravitational pull of sorrow, for he had spent his life pushing the world away. The spirit led him to an obscure part of town, a den of infamous resort where the very fabric of his life was being torn apart. Here the laws of conservation took a dark turn. The charwoman and the laundress were recycling his property, stripping the bed curtains and even the shirt from his cold body. They argued that this was merely the natural evolution of his greed. Since he had never given anything in life, it was only fitting that he be annihilated in death. Scrooge watched as his information, the memories and possessions that defined him, was treated as greasy offal. This was the entropy of the spirit, a state where a man's life reaches its maximum disorder because he refused to be the glue that held his community together. The climax of Scrooge's journey occurred in the absolute zero of a neglected churchyard. Standing before the headstone that bore his name, he faced the singularity of his own fate, a point of infinite density and zero hope. But it was in this moment of total compression that the miracle happened. Scrooge did not collapse. He exploded into a new state of being. His cry to the spirit, "I will live in the past, the present, and the future," was the unification of his fragmented self. He realized that while the classical laws of his past were written in stone, the quantum possibilities of his future were still superposed. When he woke in his own bed, the initial conditions of his world had been reset. It was no longer the bleak, biting weather of the day before, but a heavenly sky and golden sunlight. This was his personal Big Bang, a sudden inflation of joy and purpose. He ran to the window, engaging with the world not as a static observer, but as a dynamic participant. He sent the prize turkey to the Cratchits, a burst of energy that would sustain them more than any coal ever could. By choosing to radiate kindness, Scrooge bypassed the deterministic path toward a lonely grave and entered a stable orbit of human connection. He proved that the fate of the universe is not fixed. It can be changed by a single, rational heart deciding to love. In the Victorian city of London, the year 1843 served as a crucible for a social experiment. As we look at the life of Ebenezer Scrooge, we must analyse the gravitational field of his moral choices. Before his transformation, Scrooge functioned like a massive object with a density so high that nothing, not even the light of human kindness, could escape his presence. He was solitary as an oyster, a man who had engineered his own event horizon to keep the world at a distance. This isolation was not merely a character trait, it was a static state of being that defied the natural expansion of the human heart. The Newtonian laws of Scrooge's world suggested that his trajectory was fixed. Because he had invested his mass into the accumulation of wealth, he believed he was bound by a deterministic path toward a cold and silent end. He viewed the poor as a surplus population, a mathematical error in the equation of society that needed to be balanced by prisons and workhouses. However, the arrival of the spirits introduced a quantum disruption to his life. They showed him that the field of his life was not flat, but curved by the weight of his actions. Every act of greed had created a link in a chain, a distortion in the space-time of his own soul that would eventually pull him into a singularity of despair. When the ghost of Christmas yet to come led Scrooge to his own neglected grave, it presented him with a collapsed wave function. This was the definite end that awaited the man he had been, a point of infinite density where his name would be forgotten and his information lost to the rats of history. But Scrooge's realization that he could sponge away the writing on the stone was a profound quantum leap. He understood that as long as he was alive, he existed in a superposition of possibilities. He could be the ogre of the Cratchit family, or he could be their founder of the feast. His awakening on Christmas morning was a personal Big Bang, a sudden and violent inflation of his moral universe. The initial conditions of his heart were rewritten in an instant. He moved from the absolute zero of a frozen counting house to the white-hot energy of an active philanthropist. By raising Bob Cratchit's salary and providing for Tiny Tim, Scrooge introduced a strong force of benevolence that unified the disparate parts of his life. He understood that the fate of the universe is not merely a matter of fixed laws, but a result of the decisions we make within those laws. And Scrooge became a living proof that even a soul on the edge of the abyss can find the escape velocity needed to return to the light of humanity. The City of London in 1843 operated as a massive grinding machine, driven by the laws of classical mechanics and the relentless pursuit of industrial efficiency. If we examine the thermodynamics of this era, we see that wealth was often concentrated in heat sinks, like Scrooge's counting house, while the surrounding streets remained in a state of absolute zero. Charles Dickens, acting as a social observer, captured a world where the entropy of the human spirit was increasing at an alarming rate. The foul weather and the palpable brown air were not merely meteorological phenomena. They were the byproducts of a system that prioritized the velocity of commerce over the stability of the soul. Scrooge existed as an isolated system, believing that he could maintain his internal energy by refusing to exchange warmth with his fellow man. He viewed his clerk, Bob Cratchit, as a minor friction in his profit-making apparatus, a unit whose only value was its output of letters and figures. This mechanical view of life ignored the quantum vibrations of the human heart, which require interaction to thrive. Just as a static universe eventually faces collapse, Scrooge's life was reaching a point of infinite density, where his lack of empathy was creating a gravitational pull toward a lonely and neglected end. He did not realize that the fog outside was a reflection of the opacity of his own heart, which blocked out the visible light of community and shared purpose. When the ghost of Christmas past appeared, it acted as a gravitational lens, allowing Scrooge to see the curvature of his own history. In the study of the cosmos, a lens bends light to reveal what is hidden behind massive objects. In this narrative, the spirit bent the light of time to show Scrooge the initial conditions that had shaped his current trajectory. He was forced to witness the symmetry breaking of his youth, the moment when his nobler aspirations fell away, and the master passion, gain, became his universal constant. He saw his younger self in a melancholy boarding school, a solitary child left in a vast bare room, and he felt the vibration of a long-lost thermal energy returning to his heart. This journey through Mabshut time was a lesson in the conservation of memory. Scrooge realized that while the events of the past are fixed, the observer's interpretation of them can change the meaning of the present. The sight of old Fezziwig's warehouse filled with the radiant energy of a Christmas dance reminded Scrooge that a good man of business could also be a source of light for his employees. He began to see that business is not a closed loop of currency, but an open system of influence. By the time the first spirit extinguished its light and returned him to his bed, Scrooge's internal state had begun to shift. He was no longer a point-like particle in a vacuum. He was becoming aware of the entanglement between his own happiness and the well-being of the world he had tried to ignore. The appearance of the second messenger, the ghost of Christmas present, transformed Scrooge's stagnant environment into a field of immense abundance and radiant energy. This spirit represented the observable universe in all its vibrant complexity. In the year 1843, while the city struggled with social density and poverty, the spirit showed Scrooge that joy is a renewable resource that can be diffused even into the darkest corners of society. When Scrooge touched the spirit's robe, they were transported into the dynamic streets of London, where the kinetic energy of the people scraping snow and the thermal radiation from the bakers' ovens created a unified atmosphere of celebration. This was a direct contrast to Scrooge's isolated system, showing him that interaction with the world is what prevents the heat death of the human soul. The spirit's torch acted as a source of catalyst, sprinkling a supernatural essence on the dinners of the poor to enhance their cheer and harmony. Scrooge observed how this force worked most effectively on the poor because they needed it most. As they visited the Cratchit household, Scrooge witnessed the quantum entanglement of a family held together by the strong force of love rather than the mass of wealth. Bob Cratchit, earning only 15 shillings a week, presided over a system that was thermally stable despite the lack of fuel. The vibration of Tiny Tim's plaintive voice and the ordered state of the family's gratitude acted as a counterforce to the entropy of their surroundings, proving that the internal energy of a home is defined by its emotions rather than its material coordinates. As the celebration at the Cratchit house reached its peak, the spirit presented Scrooge with a predictive model of a future he had helped to create. When Scrooge inquired about the fate of Tiny Tim, the ghost revealed a vacant seat and a crutch without an owner. This shadow of the future was a deterministic outcome of the current initial conditions. If the variables of Scrooge's indifference remained unaltered, the wave function of Tim's life would collapse into death. The spirit used Scrooge's own words against him, reminding him of his previous state where he viewed the suffering as a surplus populations to be decreased. This rebuke forced Scrooge to realize that his moral calculations were flawed, as they failed to account for the infinite value of a single human quantum. The night continued as a relativistic journey, taking Scrooge to the fringe of the observable world, to the bleak moors where miners sang, and to solitary lighthouses surrounded by a raging sea. In every coordinate they visited, from the helmsman at the wheel to the sickbed of the lonely, the spirit showed that Christmas acted as a universal constant, a force that bound the hearts of men together regardless of the physical distance. However, as the midnight bell approached, the spirit's energy began to decay, and its form grew visibly older. Beneath its robes, it revealed the two monsters of humanity, ignorance and want. These were the fundamental particles of social disorder, and the spirit warned that they would lead to a total collapse of the system unless the writing on their brows was erased through enlightenment and charity. The transition from the ghost of Christmas present to the ghost of Christmas yet to come marked a fundamental shift in the observational frame of Scrooge's journey. As the clock struck the final hour of midnight in 1843, the vibrant, radiant energy of the previous spirit vanished, replaced by a solemn phantom draped in a deep black garment. This third spirit was the personification of the unknown future, a dimension where time does not speak and only points onward with a spectral hand. Scrooge felt a solemn dread in its presence, a sensation akin to standing at the edge of an event horizon, where the known laws of his existence seemed to lose their meaning. The spirit led Scrooge into the heart of the city onto Change, where the gravitational pull of money usually dictated all the movement. Here they observed groups of businessmen discussing a death with casual indifference. To these observers, the deceased was merely a variable that had been removed from the market equation, leaving behind a cheap funeral and no mourners. Scrooge searched the multitudes for his own image, but he was nowhere to be seen in his accustomed corner. He did not yet realize that he was observing the decay of his own legacy, a future state where his mass of wealth provided no attraction for human sympathy, leaving his position in the social fabric entirely vacant. The phantom glided onward, leading Scrooge into the foul and narrow alleys of an obscure part of town, a den of filth and misery. Here the laws of conservation were enacted by scavengers who had stripped a darkened chamber of its spoils. Scrooge watched in horror as a charwoman, a laundress, and an undertaker's man appraised the iron old rags and bottles they had stolen from a cold, unoccupied bed. These thieves represented the social entropy of a life lived without connection. Because the dead man had frightened everyone away while alive, his death became a profit for the vultures of the city. Scrooge pleaded to see some tenderness connected with the death, and was shown the Cratchit family grieving the vacant seat of Tiny Tim, a sharp contrast to the cold indifference he'd just witnessed. The final coordinate of this journey was a miserable, walled-in churchyard, choked by weeds and soot. The spirit pointed to a neglected grave, and Scrooge, trembling with the force of his revelation, read his own name upon the stone. This was the singular point toward which his trajectory had been heading, a future defined by absolute isolation. Falling to his knees, Scrooge made a desperate entreaty to reverse the arrow of time. He promised to honour Christmas and live in the past, the present and the future, seeking to sponge away the writing of his deterministic fate. As he clutched at the spirit's robes in a last prayer, the phantom shrunk and collapsed, returning him to the initial conditions of his own bedpost. The transition from the singular point of the grave to the initial conditions of his own bedroom was instantaneous and profound. Scrooge awoke to find his bed curtain still in place, realising that the spirits had performed their entire intervention in a single night, leaving him with the time before him to make amends. In the year 1843, Scrooge's personal Big Bang occurred. He moved from a state of infinite density and cold isolation to a radiant state of inflationary joy. He ran to his window and hailed a boy in Sunday clothes, learning that it was indeed Christmas Day. This revelation acted as a quantum leap, resetting his trajectory and filling him with a kinetic energy that compelled him to act with lightness and giddiness. His first act of redistribution was to send the prize turkey, an object as big as a boy, to the home of Bob Cratchit. This was a force of benevolence designed to offset years of negative gravity he had exerted upon his clerk's family. Scrooge took great delight in the joke of the anonymous gift, finding that his internal energy increased as he emitted generosity into the world. He walked the streets of London, not as a static observer, but as a dynamic participant, greeting every soul with a delighted giggle, and receiving blithe sounds of Merry Christmas in return. This interaction with his fellow man broke the entropy of his previous life, proving that the fate of the universe can be altered by a single rational heart. Scrooge's journey of reclamation led him next to the coordinate of his nephew Fred's house. He paced before the door a dozen times, overcoming the inertia of his past morose nature before finding the escape velocity to knock. When he entered the dining room and asked, "Will you let me in, Fred?" he was met with an explosion of wonderful unanimity and wonderful happiness. He was at home in 5 minutes, unifying his fragmented self with the family he had previously repulsed. This unification served as a final proof that human connection is a universal constant, more powerful than the accumulation of matter. The next morning, Scrooge arrived at the counting house early, hoping to catch Bob Cratchit in a moment of tardiness. When Bob arrived 18 minutes and a half behind his time, Scrooge feigned his accustomed growl before leaping from his stool to announce a salary increase. This sudden transition from ogre to benefactor was the ultimate victory of his rebirth. He promised to assist Bob's struggling family and to discuss their affairs over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. To Tiny Tim, who did not die, Scrooge became a second father, effectively sponging away the deterministic shadows the spirits had shown him. He lived the rest of his days on the total abstinence principle, becoming as good a man as the good old city ever knew. As we analyse the closing moments of our story, we must consider the immense gravity of habit that Ebenezer Scrooge had to overcome. For decades, his life followed a fixed, deterministic path, where every day was a repetition of cold calculation and isolation. The social structure of London acted as a rigid frame, keeping men like Scrooge locked in their selfish orbits. To change his nature required more than just a simple wish. It required an escape velocity generated by the profound thermal energy of his rediscovered emotions. The spirits acted as the external force necessary to perturb his static state, pushing him toward a phase transition from a cold solid to a warm radiating influence. Scrooge's realization that his future was not a fixed singularity but a superposition of possibilities allowed him to rewrite his own equations of existence. By acknowledging the entanglement between his wealth and the well-being of the Cratchit family, he moved from a closed system of greed to an open system of charity. This shift is a moral equivalent of a unified theory, where the strong force of love finally overcomes the repulsive nature of fear and isolation. He learned that the business of life is not a zero-sum game of accumulation, but a dynamic exchange where the total happiness of the system increases through distribution. The legacy of A Christmas Carol suggests that kindness functions as a universal constant in the human cosmos. Just as the laws of physics remain consistent across the vast expanses of the universe, the laws of empathy provide a stable structure for any civilization to thrive. Scrooge's final state was one of balance and harmony, where he no longer viewed the world as a collection of separate particles, but as a unified whole. His commitment to keeping Christmas well was his way of maintaining the proper frequency of his soul, ensuring that he remained in resonance with the needs of his fellow passengers to the grave. Now we see that the search for meaning in Scrooge's life mirrors their scientific quest for an ultimate theory. Both involve peeling back the layers of the unknown to find the fundamental truths that govern our reality. Whether we are discussing the origin of the universe or the rebirth of a man, the answer lies in the connection between all things. As we conclude this portion of our study, we are reminded that time is our most precious resource, and how we choose to spend it determines the curvature of our legacy. Scrooge chose to spend his time in the light, and in doing so he became a beacon of hope that continues to radiate through the centuries. To understand the full magnitude of Scrooge's transition, we must look at the social geometry of London in 1843. The city was organised into discrete clusters of wealth and poverty. The city, where Scrooge's counting house was located, acted as a high-pressure zone of financial activity, characterised by infinite density in terms of capital, but an absolute vacuum in terms of human warmth. In contrast, Camden Town, the coordinate where Bob Cratchit resided, was a low-mass region in financial terms, yet it possessed a high emotional temperature. Scrooge had lived his life as though these two regions were separated by an impenetrable barrier, believing that the internal state of his counting house had no interdependence with the external conditions of his clerk's home. He operated on a linear model of economics. 15 bob a week was the input, and Bob's labour was the output. He failed to see that the entire social system was entangled. The spirits forced him to see that a disturbance in one part of the city, such as the ignorance and want found in the shadows, would eventually lead to a total collapse of the social fabric. By the end of his journey, Scrooge recognised that he was not a point particle moving in a vacuum, but part of a unified field where every interaction creates a lasting ripple. The transformation of Ebenezer Scrooge can be viewed as a phase transition in the thermodynamics of the human soul. At the beginning of our story, Scrooge was in a solid state of ice, with a frosty rime on his head and wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature with him, effectively icing his office and resisting all external heat. This was a state of maximum entropy in a moral sense, where all useful energy for human kindness had been dissipated into the pursuit of gold. He believed in the conservation of wealth as a fundamental law, not realizing that wealth kept in a closed system eventually leads to spiritual heat death. The intervention of the three spirits introduced thermal energy back into Scrooge's system. The ghost of Christmas past provided the infrared heat of memory. The ghost of Christmas present provided the visible light of current reality. And the ghost of Christmas yet to come provided the ultraviolet warning of an approaching singularity. When Scrooge awoke on Christmas morning, he was no longer a cold solid, but a radiating gas, expanding with lightness and giddiness. He realised that generosity is a catalyst that increases the total energy of the world. By emitting warmth toward the Cratchit family and his nephew Fred, he reversed the arrow of time that was leading him toward a cold and neglected grave, proving that even a singular heart can reset its own initial conditions and find harmony within the universal laws of love. To understand the full magnitude of the transformation we have witnessed, we must look at the mechanical determinism that governed the era of 1843. The social structures of the time were built upon a rigid, almost Newtonian logic, where the poor were viewed as a friction in the gears of industrial progress. Scrooge's earlier belief in the surplus population was not merely a personal flaw, it was a reflection of a world that viewed human beings as point-like particles with no internal energy, moving only when acted upon by the external forces of hunger or law. This era believed in a static social universe where everyone had a fixed position and the gravitational pull of poverty was considered an inescapable law of nature. In this cold, deterministic model, Scrooge acted as an isolated observer who refused to acknowledge the quantum entanglement of his own fate with that of his clerk Bob Cratchit. He lived in a state of high spiritual density where his mass of wealth created an event horizon that blocked out the visible light of human sympathy. He believed that the union workhouses and the poor law were sufficient regulatory systems to handle the entropy of the city, failing to realise that these systems lacked the moral heat necessary to sustain the human spirit. It was only through the intervention of the three messengers that Scrooge was forced to look beyond the mechanical laws of the counting house and see the dynamic, expanding nature of human potential. When Scrooge finally awoke on Christmas morning, he experienced what we might call a relativistic shift in his perception of time and space. The heavy bell that had previously marked his steps toward a lonely grave now signalled a new beginning, a reset of his initial conditions. He moved from a frame of reference defined by absolute isolation to one defined by universal connection. His kinetic energy was no longer directed toward the accumulation of matter, but toward the emission of joy. He realized that the arrow of time does not have to lead toward increasing disorder. Through conscious action, he could reorganize his life into a state of high moral order. By sending the prize turkey to Camden Town and raising Bob Cratchit's salary, Scrooge introduced a strong force of benevolence into a system that had been frozen in absolute zero. He broke the symmetry of his old selfish existence and found a new equilibrium within the community. This was the ultimate victory of the human heart over the cold laws of the marketplace. Scrooge proved that even in a universe that seems governed by fixed rules, there is always room for a quantum leap of faith. He became a second father to Tiny Tim, effectively changing the future trajectory of an entire family, and proving that the fate of our personal universe is never truly written in stone until the very end. As we examine the final chapters of our narrative, we must reflect on the curvature of the moral universe that Ebenezer Scrooge eventually discovered. In the year 1843, Scrooge lived as though his life were a straight, narrow line, moving toward a single point of cold finality. He was convinced that the mass of his gold gave him an independence from the suffering of others, much like a star that believes it is not affected by the galaxies around it. However, the three spirits acted as a gravitational lens, bending his path and showing him that his actions created a deep distortion in the space-time of those he touched. Every refusal to help and every bah humbug was a link in a heavy chain that was pulling his own soul toward a singularity of total isolation. The ghost of Christmas yet to come presented him with the most terrifying observation. A future where his life was treated as mere refuse, as greasy offal in a shop of thieves. This was the ultimate entropy of a man who had refused to contribute any positive energy to the world. In that cold, dark chamber, Scrooge realized that if he did not change his trajectory, the information of his life would be lost forever, leaving behind no warmth and no legacy. He understood that the laws of his personal physics, the greed and the cold, were not universal constants, but choices that had curved his universe toward darkness. He begged for the chance to sponge away the writing on the stone, effectively asking to rewrite the initial conditions of his own fate. The awakening of Scrooge on Christmas morning was the ultimate unification of his past, present and future. He no longer saw these as separate, disconnected segments of time, but as a single, fluid reality where every moment was a chance for expansion. By choosing to live in all three at once, he resolved the paradoxes of his nature. He utilized the memories of his past to fuel his current actions, and he utilized the vision of his future to ensure he remained on a path of light. He moved from being a static particle to a dynamic wave of benevolence, radiating joy across London. When Scrooge entered the home of his nephew Fred, he was not just attending a dinner. He was completing a circuit of human electricity that had been broken for years. He was better than his word, becoming a second father to Tiny Tim, and a master who recognized that the true business of life is the welfare of others. This transformation serves as a final proof that the human spirit is not a closed system. We are all capable of a sudden transition, a quantum leap that takes us from the absolute zero of indifference to the white-hot energy of love. As we leave the world of Scrooge, we are reminded that the only constant in the human universe is the capacity for change and the infinite potential for redemption. In the year 1843, the moral geometry of London reached a critical point within the spirit of Ebenezer Scrooge. As he stood before the solemn phantom of the future, He realised that the laws of his existence had led him to a neglected grave in a churchyard choked by weeds. This was the singular point of his previous trajectory, a destination of absolute isolation, where his mass of wealth provided no human attraction. The spirit's silence acted as a vacuum undone, forcing Scrooge to fill the void with his own desperate entreaty for a new beginning. He understood that the entropy of his life had reached its maximum, and only a quantum leap of faith could reverse the arrow of time. Scrooge's plea to sponge away the writing on the stone represented a desire to reset the initial conditions of his universe. He promised to honour Christmas and live in the past, the present and the future, effectively seeking a unification of his fragmented timeline. This transformation was not a gradual change, but a sudden transition from a cold solid to a radiating influence. When the phantom collapsed into his bedpost, the curvature of Scrooge's fate was instantly straightened. He was no longer bound by the deterministic shadows of his former self, but was free to expand into a new state of charity and joy. The moment Scrooge realised he had not missed Christmas Day, he entered a phase of inflationary joy that mirrored the big bang of a new creation. He found himself as light as a feather and as giddy as a drunken man, terms that describe the total dissipation of the heavy chains he had forged in his previous life. His internal energy was so high that he could not contain his delight, running to the window to greet the golden sunlight and heavenly sky. This new epoch began with a massive redistribution of mass in the form of the prize turkey sent to Bob Cratchit. It was an act of pure benevolence that served to offset the negative gravity of his years of indifference. Scrooge's interaction with the city became a series of positive collisions. He met the portly gentleman on the street and offered a munificent donation, a great many back payments that corrected the asymmetry of his past greed. He then moved toward the coordinate of his nephew's house, seeking to unify with the family he had long repulsed. By the time he sat down to dinner with Fred and his niece, the interference patterns of his life had shifted from destructive to constructive. He had proven that human connection is a universal constant that can thaw even the absolute zero of a frozen heart. In the year 1843, the static universe of Ebenezer Scrooge's life was replaced by a dynamic equilibrium of active kindness. Having escaped the event horizon of his own greed, Scrooge understood that his business was no longer the mere accumulation of matter in a counting house, but the constant emission of goodwill. This transformation was a phase transition that affected every coordinate of his daily existence. When he arrived at his office on the day after Christmas, he did not seek to conserve his wealth. Instead, he sought to assist the struggling family of Bob Cratchit, effectively increasing the total energy of their small system in Camden Town. Scrooge's new trajectory was characterised by a constant velocity of generosity. He realised that the laws of the heart are just as fixed and reliable as the laws of physics, and that by aligning himself with the universal constant of love, he could ensure a stable and harmonious future. He no longer viewed his fellow man as random particles colliding in a vacuum, but as entangled beings whose happiness was deeply interdependent. This unification of his personal and professional life allowed him to resonate with the good old city in a way he had never imagined possible. The most significant variable in Scrooge's new moral equation was the life of Tiny Tim. In the shadows of the future shown by the spirit, Tim's wave function had collapsed into a vacant seat, but Scrooge's intervention changed the initial conditions. By becoming a second father to the boy, Scrooge provided the strong force necessary to stabilise Tim's existence. This act of reclamation was a victory over the entropy of ignorance and want, proving that the fate of a child is not predetermined by the cold mechanics of a surplus population. Scrooge's life became a source of light that continued to radiate long after his transformation. He lived with the total abstinence principle regarding his old morose ways, ensuring that the arrow of time in his life always pointed toward greater order and compassion. People who once feared his frosty rhyme now laughed at the alteration in him, and Scrooge let them laugh, knowing that a grinning eye is far better than the malady of a closed heart. His conclusion was the same as Tiny Tim's famous observation: God bless us everyone, a universal theory that encompasses every soul in the known universe. In our final analysis of Ebenezer Scrooge's journey through the year 1843, we see a remarkable convergence between the laws of the physical world and the laws of human morality. Just as a scientist seeks a theory of everything to explain how the strong force and gravity work together to hold the universe in balance, Charles Dickens presents us with a moral unification. Scrooge's life began as a fragmented theory, where he believed that the sheer mass of his wealth existed independently of the energy of all human connection. He operated under a classical understanding of the world, where every person was a separate particle moving in a vacuum of self-interest. However, the spirits introduced him to a quantum reality where every soul is entangled. The ghost of Christmas past showed him that his initial conditions, the loneliness and heartache of his youth, were the variables that set his trajectory. The ghost of Christmas present revealed the radiant spectrum of life happening in the now, proving that joy is a universal constant that can be diffused even into the absolute zero of a poor man's home, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come forced him to face the singularity of his own death, a point where his information would be lost to the entropy of a neglected grave. By the end of this journey, Scrooge realised that mankind was his business, a unified field where the welfare of one affects the welfare of all. The story of the carol concludes not with a big crunch of despair, but with a big bang of redemption that continues to expand through the space-time of our shared history. Ebenezer Scrooge's rebirth on Christmas morning was a phased transition that proved no heart is too dense to be thawed by the heat of compassion. He moved from a static state of isolation to a dynamic state of contribution, effectively reversing the arrow of time that was leading him toward annihilation. By becoming a second father to Tiny Tim and a good master to the good old city, he fine-tuned his own existence to be a source of light rather than a vacuum of greed. As we listen to the final echoes of the merry bells in London, we are reminded that the ultimate goal of our own journey is to find harmony within the universal laws of love and grace. We are all observers in this strange and wonderful universe, and our decisions determine the curvature of the world we leave behind. Just as the stars are held in their orbits by gravity, we are held together by the unseen bonds of humanity. May we all possess the knowledge of how to keep Christmas well, and like Tiny Tim, may we recognise the ultimate truth that encompasses every soul in the known universe. God bless us everyone.